Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues and friends, good morning or good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. Thank you for joining us here today from around the world for this special event on the topic Peace Through Justice with Judge Thomas Buergenthal. My name is Viviane Dittrich and I warmly welcome you from Nuremberg on behalf of the International Nuremberg Principles Academy. My virtual background today is Courtroom 600. The very courtroom where the Nuremberg trials took place more than 75 years ago. In the next 90 minutes, we will first show the documentary entitled Peace Through Justice, which will also feature Courtroom 600. And then we will have a live conversation with Judge Buergenthal, who will share some personal reflections on his life, on the interplay of peace and justice, and on his own commitment to seeking accountability without revenge, and the current challenges in the field today. It is so wonderful to have Tom with us here today, joining us from the US. At the outset, I would indeed like to most warmly welcome our special guest of honor today, Thomas Buergenthal, Judge Buergenthal, who has had a most distinguished career in international law. His life is exemplary in many, many ways. His lifetime achievements and important and valuable contributions to international law are countless and are too many to be mentioned just briefly here. He has presented, of course, his moving account of his childhood experience surviving the Holocaust at the age of 11 in his memoir, A Lucky Child, which was published in the US and the UK over a decade ago now, became a bestseller and has been translated into many languages, amongst them German under the title Ein Glückskind, French, L'Enfant de la Chance, and Spanish, Un Niño Afortunado. As a Holocaust survivor and jurist, Judge Buergenthal has been a tireless champion for the principle that governments, as well as individuals, must be held accountable under international law for human rights violations. He has continued to push for law, tirelessly advocating the idea of reconciliation and justice. Imagine a time when there were no books on international human rights law. Well, Tom Buergenthal, together with, at the time as Professor Louis Sohn, paved the way and truly pioneered the field that is known today as international human rights law. He is the author or co-author of more than a dozen books and numerous articles. He is the Lobinger Professor Emeritus of Comparative Law and Jurisprudence at George Washington University Law School. In addition to his teaching and writing landmark books and articles, Tom Buergenthal has been a key member of several international bodies, including the United Nations Human Rights Committee and the Truth Commission for El Salvador. Since the late 1970s, on a domestic front in the United States, he was involved with the US Holocaust Memorial Council and its museum. In the late 1990s, he was chairman of the Committee on Conscience. Considered one of the world's leading international human rights experts, Professor Buergenthal was a judge and president of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. In March of 2000, he was elected the American judge for the principal organ of the United Nations, the principal judicial organ, the International Court of Justice, where he served as a judge for over a decade. So in a nutshell, Tom has made a difference in countless ways, as expert, as judge, as lawyer, as a scholar, and as a teacher. We are so delighted you immediately accepted our invitation and are joining us here today, dear Tom. Many, many thanks. Your special connection to the Nuremberg Academy and your continuous engagement truly means a lot to us. As Tom is open to questions from the audience during the live conversation also later today, we invite you to use the Q&A tool at the bottoms of your screen. Please keep in mind that due to the large number of participants and limited time, perhaps not all questions may be answered. A special thank you at the outset also to the Nuremberg Academy team supporting the event today behind the scenes. Thank you. Please note that the event is being recorded and will be made available. The documentary we are about to screen, entitled Peace Through Justice, by filmmakers Ilona Kalmbach and Sabine Jainski from Competent Film Production, presents the life and legacy of Judge Thomas Buergenthal, Honorary President of the Advisory Council of the International Nuremberg Principals Academy. The film shows the extraordinary life of Judge Buergenthal and his influence on global efforts to educate and to empower a new generation of lawyers to seek justice for victims and survivors and to seek accountability for perpetrators. The documentary has been realized with the kind support of the Zukunftsstiftung der Stadt Sparkasse Nürnberg. The filmmakers Ilona Kalmbach and Sabine Jainski and Competent Film Production had previously realized acclaimed films about key figures, such as Beate Klaasfeld and Simone Weil. The documentary Peace Through Justice has so far been screened in Nuremberg, The Hague, Washington, DC, Berlin, and Jena. Most fondly, I remember our last meeting in person, Tom, on the occasion of the film screening in Washington, DC, in partnership with the US Holocaust Memorial Museum and the panel discussion that ensued, moderated by the director of the Academy, Klaus Rackwitz. Today is the first global online screening to an audience worldwide. So I'd like to again thank those who are joining us today from near and from far on this special occasion. A warm welcome to you all. We have been so pleased with the positive echo of our initiative to screen the documentary online and to have it followed by a live conversation with Tom. We have participants from around the world today, including international and national judges, prosecutors, lawyers, experts and officials from international courts and tribunals, representatives from government and civil society, as well as scholars and students. Thank you for joining us. Fondly, I personally remember very, very well Tom's visit to Nuremberg with his wife Peggy on the occasion of the film shooting that took place in Nuremberg, and we'll see a few scenes of that in just a short while. So now, without further ado, let's start the film.
The city of Nuremberg makes international legal history. Since 2014, the headquarters of the International Nuremberg Principals Academy has been located here. Starting in 1945, the Nuremberg trials were held in the Palace of Justice in Courtroom 600 to prosecute prominent Nazi war criminals. For the first time, heads of state and members of government were convicted of crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The principles applied in these proceedings are still the basis of international criminal law today, the Nuremberg Principles.
Please be seated.
Firstly, I would like the parties to introduce themselves for record. We start with the prosecution, please.
Now, it is my distinct pleasure to invite our special guest of honor today, the protagonist of the film himself, to join me for a live conversation. It's a true delight. Tom, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you very much. I'm really moved.
It is a complete privilege and pleasure speaking to you and truly inspiring listening to you. So I very much look forward to your personal reflections in the live conversation that we're about to have.
Thank you.
Having just watched the film, which I know you also have previously seen, what stands out for you when reflecting back on the making of the film, which essentially is revisiting your entire life and significant moments from your childhood and adulthood and distinguished career?
Well, first of all, it's wonderful always to see young people being drawn into the type of work that needs to be done around the world. And coming back to Göttingen, for example, and then actually having this wonderful lady thanking me, and I certainly don't deserve the thanks, but it was to be again confirmed in the notion that this is a very different Germany than the Germany that I remember every time I come to Germany.
You, of course, have written your memoir, A Lucky Child, about your early childhood, and I've read it several times and can only wholeheartedly recommend it to everyone. Many find it interesting, of course, that you decided nearly 6 decades later to write about these childhood experiences surviving the Holocaust. What did it mean to you to write the book? And did you expect the critical acclaim it has received?
No, I must say I was surprised. It's now been translated in 16 different countries, including China and Japan. I didn't expect that. I basically wrote it for myself and for our children, because I thought it was important for them to remember what happened to us. And also how one should react to situations like this when things have turned around. So that's been sort of the most moving part for me. And the book, well, I must say, I was totally surprised by the success of the book. And I, to this day, wonder what, for example, the readers in China or Japan get from reading this book about things that are taking place so far, far away. But I really wanted also to be on record about saying what happened to us and what it meant to individual families like our small family.
I understand that you have been working actually on a second memoir, which we are all eagerly waiting to read, of course. What is important to you in the writing process and in this very personal reflection on your own life?
Well, first of all, I should tell you that my second memoir, I almost have daily arguments with my wife about it, in the sense that she keeps saying, tell more things about your personal life, and I keep insisting on telling you things about the law. So I don't know what will happen with this second book, who will carry the day. But I'm basically writing about my own personal development in the years after I wrote the first book. So it's not the regular memoir about more individual things, but it's more about my work. It's really, my work has been me in all these years.
Definitely.
I hope I'm almost done, and I hope it'll be more successful than I think at this moment it will be. So we'll see.
Fantastic news, and we certainly very much look forward to reading about your reflections on the law and on the many contributions to international law over the decades. You are known for your belief, of course, in the power of the legal profession and human rights, frequently stating that part of your human rights work was motivated one way or another in believing that law could have prevented the Holocaust, perhaps, or at least alleviated the suffering of so many. Which part of your career or experiences were most decisive in that regard?
That's a very good and very difficult question to answer. Actually, just putting together materials to teach students about what we should be doing when confronted with situations like the Holocaust, and continuously finding how difficult it is to come up with solutions. It's easier to sort of talk in general about things that need to be done, but much harder to come up and think one has found some ways to deal with the terrible things that are still happening in so many different countries, and hoping really that the citizens of those countries will have the same experience that I had with Germany after the war, and seeing how much Germany learned in the process. And sometimes hoping and wondering at the same time whether other countries will be able to deal with those problems as effectively as some countries in recent years have dealt with them.
Mm. Absolutely. And you mentioned that you have always been a messenger for reconciliation and forgiveness. And we heard that very powerfully and eloquently being articulated in the documentary we just saw. That you firmly believe that hatred creates more hatred and that there can be no peace really without reconciliation. So in your view, what role does justice play in peace processes? And is it ever too late to seek justice or reconciliation?
Well, I must say, if we forget that justice can create peace, honest peace, we'll never have real justice. It's important to me when I suddenly got the message, so to speak, in terms of what is necessary to establish an effective international human rights system. What I felt was important, that I still do, is that one honestly believes that it's possible, and one works to make it possible. And sometimes this is very disappointing. You look at certain countries and you say, my God, they haven't figured it out yet. And then others, you suddenly say, surprised, they're doing well. And that always gives me hope, and it gives me a sort of impetus to push for more, to do more. And now that I'm retired, I can focus on all the things that I wanted to say, and that my wife says I should be doing. Although we have a wonderful way of resolving our problems.
Absolutely, and we'll have a moment in just a short while to speak about perhaps some of these examples and some of the concerns about the ongoing crimes or human rights violations that you just mentioned. Allow me to just briefly take you back in time for a moment. November 2020 marked the 75th anniversary of the opening of the Nuremberg trials. And indeed, the complete records are available online now for the first time, as the United Nations, the US Holocaust Memorial Museum and the Memorial de la Shoah cooperatively digitized the entire film and audio records. And they've been now placed online at everyone's availability. So traveling back in time to the Nuremberg trials, how did you personally experience the trials at the time back in 1945 and 1946?
Well, it's interesting what actually happened. I was, as the movie showed, I was separated from my parents, first my mother and then my father. And when I was reunited again with my mother, there was about the time when the trials were going on. And at one moment, we suddenly heard by hanging or by the convictions. And I was so excited that these people are finally paying the price for what they did. And then later on, I thought, I felt a little sort of ashamed of myself that I reacted to it the way, with just the excitement that some people, even though they deserved it, are going to be hanged or are going to be executed. And whenever I think of Nuremberg, I think of my own reaction at the time in Göttingen, and then my shame, really, that I reacted the way I reacted. And so whenever I talk about the Nuremberg trials, I can never separate it. First, the wonderful thing that I was reunited with my mother just about that time, that I heard somebody in Göttingen apologize, which I certainly didn't deserve to have happen in Göttingen, and then being able to come to the conclusion that what happened in Nuremberg was very important, and I only hope, and working really, trying to hope and make it possible for this process to continue. We still have a long way to go, unfortunately. That's what bothers me, and I'm not getting any younger.
Mm. When you think of the Nuremberg Principles and Courtroom 600 today, what does it evoke within you? How has the legacy been lived up to of Nuremberg?
Well, initially you react in a very strange way because people tend to criticize what happened in Nuremberg. But it's very important to remember that Nuremberg really, as you mentioned in the introduction, it laid the foundation for the efforts that we have to continue year in and year out about trying to prevent what happened in Nuremberg, what happened in Nazi Germany, and create a world in which governments don't commit those terrible crimes. So whenever I think of Nuremberg, I always think of Göttingen, of hearing by hanging or by execution, and then feeling a little ashamed, and then gradually getting over it and saying, we have to do something about creating a world in which we no longer have to establish other Nurembergs. But I am totally very much in favor, or rather supporting what happened in Nuremberg. Without that if that hadn't been done, I think we would have had real trouble being, say, in Germany and other countries where we are today. Mm. A very important precedent that we have to maintain and cherish.
Absolutely. And on various other occasions, you have spoken movingly about the challenge to prevent one's own experiencing coloring one's professional judgment. How would you say did your experience better equip you for your judicial roles that you've held? And what do you consider the most important qualities of an international judge?
Well, I think the important thing about a judge is, first of all, to approach cases in an honest, non-hateful, not prejudiced way, but to deal with it as honestly as possible and apply the law faithfully. And that's not always easy because one has sort of grown up with all kinds of prejudices, all kinds of beliefs that don't really quite fit with. And so as a judge, you have to continuously say to yourself, am I really being honest in dealing with this case? And watch yourself. If judges forget to watch themselves, there won't be justice in the world.
I mean, you were appointed as a judge by Costa Rica in 1979. You were one of the first judges on the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, laying the groundwork. The court, of course, to the present day, plays an enormously important role, especially in Latin America. Under your presidency, the court rendered a landmark decision awarding compensation to families of victims of disappearance in Honduras. The topic of the international conference organized by the Nuremberg Academy in May 2021 is precisely the prohibition, the prosecution, and the prevention of enforced disappearances. What, in your view, has progress been made regarding the prosecution and prevention of enforced disappearances since the groundbreaking work of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights many decades ago?
Well, I think we really faced on the court a basic problem that often confronts courts. What are the legal principles do we apply to this situation? And we worked it out, and we produced a principle that courts could use to deal with disappearances. And it's today still, it's the important principle in dealing with those type of crimes. And I must say it's probably the thing that I'm most proud of in terms of having participated in a court that was able to come up with this principle that we developed, that I for a long time thought it was impossible to come up with an objective principle to deal with disappearances. And we managed to do it. And I think I I hope that we can deal with other cases around the world in a similar fashion with legal principles that are applicable, relevant to the particular facts before them. And that's not always easy.
Definitely. Definitely. And I think it's an ongoing challenge today, as you mentioned, but it's certainly groundbreaking work that you were leading there. In terms of switching to your other experience as a judge at the International Court of Justice, of course, it's the 18th of April 2021 marks the 75th anniversary of the court itself. And you served as a judge of the ICJ for over 10 years. Most of the audience are familiar with your work on the arrest warrant case and your dissenting opinion and the advisory opinion on the legality of the construction of a wall on the Palestinian territory. How important, in your view, is the work of the International Court of Justice for the development of international law and the law within national jurisdictions?
I think it's of vital importance. If we didn't have the International Court of Justice, we would have to invent it. It's so important. Now, it's very often we international lawyers are critical about what the court is doing, and we act as if it was not as important as it is. It's the one tool we have to confront governments that are violating international human rights law. And this court, the International Court of Justice, still has a long way to go to get enough of these cases. Unfortunately, the jurisdictional objections to the jurisdiction of the court are such that many countries escape the reach of the court. But if we can gradually change that and enable cases to come to the court the way cases come to courts ordinarily, without any prejudging of artificial jurisdictional prohibitions, I think it'll be vital. But the existence of the court is critical because it shows what can be done. And I believe very strongly that if we'd had the International Court of Justice in 37, 38, we might very well have affected what was happening in Germany. Many people disagree with me, but that's the importance I attach to the court. We need to publicize it more, but it's vital if international lawyers will, if it ever really can serve or rather if it can do what it needs to be do. It can't do it without having the court.
And speaking of its vital role that you just emphasized, is there anything in particular that stood out for you at your time at the court? Is there a particular case you found or remember as particularly path-breaking that was a highlight for you to work on, even though I imagine it is very, very difficult to pinpoint any particular case in a decade-long engagement with the court? But is there anything you would highlight from today's point of view?
Well, I found the case about the Israel and the problem that with the settlements. It was important to me to go on record that the settlements were a violation of international law, and I regretted really that I couldn't persuade my colleagues to take the same position I did. At the same time, I found it both difficult to understand that so many people said, well, if Buergenthal dissented, obviously he's in favor of Israel. So the International Court of Justice faces this problem all the time. But I must say, to me, the International Court of Justice is critical, but I also hope that we can strengthen it. And to date, it's not as strong as it could be, as it should be.
Speaking of your human rights work, in 2019, you were awarded with the Edith Stein Prize for your high-level commitment across state borders, helping to enforce human rights as universal and inalienable rights to which everyone is entitled. From your perspective, what are the biggest challenges today to a universally accepted system or set of human rights?
Well, I'm not sure I really know. That is to say, we have the institutions, but of course the institutions are oftentimes weakened by political problems in individual countries and individual ambitions of the politicians. And also the weakness in certain countries of the democratic institutions. You put all of this together, and it's quite difficult to establish a truly effective international legal system that can deal with genocide, crimes against humanity, and so forth. Because in various countries, the internal system is such that they won't submit to jurisdiction, and if they do, they come up with all kinds of excuses. All of those things need to be managed, and we're not there yet. But I think some countries have already come up with all kinds of examples. I must say, I still find it very difficult that the United States hasn't really accepted the jurisdiction of the court in its broader sense, and some other countries. So, I'm sure that many lawyers who agree with me in other countries face the same problem. That is one thing to talk big and then confront politicians who have their own political goals that don't necessarily correspond with the important need to create effective justice in the world.
Mm. As Professor Steinhardt says in the film, war tends to be a human rights crisis in its later stages. And you just mentioned the contested multilateralism, the erosion of the rule of law worldwide. What is necessary from your perspective, for the effective prevention of atrocities and accountability efforts in order to also uphold a wider rules-based international order?
Well, first of all, I think we need to have, in many democratic countries, we still don't have enough teaching about it at the school level, at the student level, even on the grade school level. We should start with the first grade and teach about these things so that when children grow up, they've already had to confront the notion of what is international justice. That is still missing in many countries. And it's missing in many democratic countries where one could actually create the system, but the politics get in the way.
Speaking of teaching, and I'm glad to see that we've been receiving some questions from the audience. I'd like to organically integrate them into our conversation. And one question is precisely about your own experience being a student and then becoming a teacher and entering the academic profession, writing these books. The question is, how did Professor Sohn at the time come to ask you to collaborate at Harvard Law School on human rights law? Could you give a personal flavor in terms of, you writing together this very, very foundational book? How did that experience come to be in your own experience of learning and teaching?
Well, he was my professor both for different degrees at Harvard. And in the first degree, I received my Master's of Law at Harvard, and he was my main professor. And at that time, I felt what we really needed was a book on the subject. And so I went back to teaching, now having had the master's degree. I went back to my university and started teaching. And then I realized that really I needed much more extensive documents So I began to put together documents, what I thought was going to be my book on the international protection of human rights. And then I decided to go back to Harvard for the Doctor of Juridical Science. And at one point, I said to Louis Sohn, I'm working on the subject and I have some documents. So he said, well, let me see your documents that you've put together. And he looked at them and then he said, you know, I've been doing the same thing. I've been putting documents together. Why don't we write the book together? And it's something I'd never expected that he would ask me to do that. And then it was wonderful to be your professor is suddenly your co-author, and you can argue with him, you can fight him, and you come up putting together a book that will have the impact that it had. I think it's important also for the people in the audience to realize that Louis Sohn was born in Lemberg, Lviv as it is now. And he came as a refugee to Harvard before the war started. So he and I shared very much a background and an interest in human rights that went beyond just the academic. And that made it so much easier. What is also interesting, I think the audience would enjoy this, when I said to him then that I wanted to write my doctorate about human rights, he said, no, I'm not going to allow you to do that. I want you to write about an organization, international organization, you know nothing about. So if you're trying to find out the book that Buergenthal wrote that he knew nothing about, is the book on the International Civil Aviation Organization. That was the one organization I knew nothing about. And I went to him and I said, I'll write about that. And he said, yes, that you can do, but no book separate on human rights. That's the story.
That's a wonderful story. And thanks for taking us behind the scenes of the making of.
Yes.
How this actually came together, the genesis, and also fascinating to learn about Lemberg. And of course, we've known who else in terms of protagonists of the early days of international criminal law come from Lemberg through Philip Sands' East-West Street. It seems that Lemberg really has been a hub of brilliant legal minds.
Yeah. And he was really the type of incarnation of a great law teacher, in particular in this field where his heart was also in the field.
Definitely. Another question that has reached us, Tom, is about reparations. The question asks whether you think enough is being done in terms of reparations in the present context of international criminal law, or whether you think something else should be done in terms of reparations.
That's a difficult question. Well, I should tell you first about reparations. When my mother came back to Göttingen at the end of the war, if we didn't have the Wiedergutmachung, she wouldn't have had anything to live on. And the Wiedergutmachung was the thing that helped her start a new life. And I would think that the Wiedergutmachung system, the reparation system established in Germany, helped so many people who would have otherwise not been able to make it and recover from the suffering from the terrible pain and suffering they had to deal with during the war under Hitler. So that's the only experience that I have with restitution. And I think that's probably the same in many other countries. You hear so much about how much money they get in restitution. Very often the victims are not really getting what they deserve. I must say, I think the German restitution system is probably the strongest one, and it's still working today. And it wouldn't have, for example, when I got to Göttingen, I also got a small pension, which over the years has grown. And I always look at that amount and remember Göttingen and think what would have happened if we had nothing, really, because everything was confiscated. The shoe store was there, but it didn't belong to us anymore. So I think one needs to look at restitution for crimes committed in violation of international human rights in terms of what they do for people who are the victims who suddenly have nothing. And that's often forgotten. When, for example, I know the criticism in Germany about also about Wiedergutmachung. What is forgotten is what the people had when they came back. And that is probably true in so many other countries where some form of restitution has been established. It's probably never enough. The criticism is always greater.
Mm. And reparations, of course, come post facto, come after the violations have been committed. And another question from the audience is about prevention. So avoiding altogether or minimizing violations of human rights. What are your perspectives on what else could be done to prevent human rights violations? Are there any positive examples that you can think of, or any particular advice you would have to policymakers today?
You know, those are wonderful questions. And those are the questions I've struggled with all my life. I think what we first of all need is truly establish, truly democratic, honest to goodness democratic governments in power in countries. Without that, there's really going to never be an effective prevention of these crimes. One needs to have a true democracy, which is not all that easy to establish, because even in our most democratic countries, we have some problems. But the struggle has to be to establish a fair, democratic political system in which people, the inhabitants, have a self-interest and a commitment to protecting human rights. I think if you have a commitment to protect human rights in a country, honestly, that's already restitution, already. And that's not easy to do. Because the criticism is always, oh, look how much money they get. And it's instead of creating a really strong democratic system. Mm. And it's not there. I mean, when you think about how many democratic countries do we have, truly democratic countries in the world, if you just look at 100 countries, we don't have very many. Mm. And in many countries, we have serious violations of human rights from the lack of violations of human rights that start small and get bigger. Mm. Mm. And you have to forgive me. I am losing my. How do I say? I was so moved by what was happening in the program today that I find it difficult to respond seriously to the questions you're asking me.
You're wonderful. Thank you, Tom. No, absolutely. We have a couple of questions more before closing our program today. And just a couple of questions came in on the role of the International Court of Justice. So one is about whether you believe that the International Court of Justice can live up to its precedent in the case of Gambia versus Myanmar and handle more such cases in the future, being a forum for these types of.
Well, I think it goes, the court's problem is also that, you know, in back of the court's mind is always its limited jurisdiction. And so the court worries about its limited jurisdiction, and it worries about the extent to which it can go further than it thinks it can go to protect its own domain, so to speak. So I think we need more cases like this. We need more we need to really change the jurisdictional basis of the court. It has to become a court to which every country can just bring a case without having had to accept the jurisdiction of the court. And whether the court can exercise jurisdiction, whether the country wants it to exercise jurisdiction or not. That doesn't exist today. Countries have to come to the court. The court has to have jurisdiction to handle the case. All of these problems, and especially the big jurisdictional issues like genocide and others, they very seldom come to the court. And the court really has no way to get hold of them, despite the fact that there are a lot of violations of human rights, large violations of human rights taking place in many countries.
Definitely. And one avenue that some states have more recently gone down is that of universal jurisdiction, going from, the interplay of the international and the national level. Another question relates to, what are your thoughts on universal jurisdiction as a venue or an avenue to address international crimes currently taking place in countries such as Myanmar today or Syria?
No, I think if we really want to establish a fully working system, we have to have universal jurisdiction. And that's a long way to come. I think I won't see it anymore. You may be able to. You're much younger than I am, but it'll take a long time, but it's critical. The court has to be a court like a court that can hear cases that are brought to it without obstacles put in its way of a jurisdictional character.
Definitely. What is your sense of the interplay of law and politics? This is another theme that has been addressed in the questions that we've been receiving from the audience today. What is your understanding of the interplay between law and politics in achieving justice for victims?
I think that I have difficulties with the question, because to me, law and justice and politics, justice should be the thing that controls politics. So the dichotomy between the two isn't necessarily real. There are all these obstacles, political obstacles, put in the way of justice in many countries. And that makes it so difficult in many countries to deal with the real problems that need to be dealt with justice.
Definitely, and certainly we're seeing a certain politicization also of these issues time and again.
Yes. And also, well, I think it's wonderful that we have the International Court of Justice. I believe that in the long run, we will have one that is a great court that can deal with all of the problems that we face in the world. And if it is, then we're going to have small courts in different countries that will play the role that they need to play to create internal justice. But we have a long way to go yet.
Absolutely. I think a long way to go. Also, another question from the audience precisely looked at preventing or addressing current conflicts, given the jurisdictional gaps and limitations that we see of the current architectural infrastructure, and how this can be improved in this regard. And I know some have pinpointed their concerns about fragmentation of law, but I believe you do not share that concern.
No, I don't. I mean, fragmentation, if what is being fragmented is justice and fairness, but honest justice and fairness, I don't have any problems with it. The more, the better. The problem is that the International Court of Justice faces so many restraints to deal with the real problems in the world that it can't really play the role it should be playing. And we need to create also smaller courts in different regions that we have, for example, European Court of Human Rights, which plays an important role, the Inter-American Court, and we're now beginning with the African Court, where much more work needs to be done. But all of these movements are very important, and it takes time. My biggest sort of wish, or I would beg the audience not to lose patience. The most important thing in our field is to believe that it's possible, that justice is possible, that it can be done eventually, fully. If we reach the conclusion, no, it'll never happen, it'll never happen. So to me, it's so important for people like us, that is to say lawyers and others who play a role, to remain patient and to realize it takes time.
Definitely, and I think your plea for patience and appeal is well heard. Finally, before we come to an end of this program, final question about the intertwining between human rights law and international criminal law. The question that was posed again by the audience is, what role should human rights principles play in the interpretation and application of the Rome Statute today?
I don't even know how to answer that. Can you help me a little bit? What is meant by it?
I think it's pointing to the interplay of human rights law and international criminal law. And well, the question asked about how human rights principles could be playing a role in the interpretation and application of the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court.
I must say, let me admit that I don't know enough really about the current working of the International Criminal Court. So I don't feel that I can answer. To me, I don't think the International Criminal Court can work effectively if it doesn't have a human right basis. You can't apply, if you apply international criminal law without remembering international human rights law, you're not really doing what needs to be done. But it's wonderful to have an international criminal court. Whether the existence of the International Criminal Court is in the way of developing the type of work that the International Court of Justice should be doing is another issue to me. So I at the same time, the more courts like this we create, what do we take away from the International Court of Justice? Or do we forget that we need to strengthen the International Court?
And Tom, wrapping up, a final question. What gives you a sense of optimism despite ongoing grave human rights violations across the world, and despite the pushback or even backlash against international courts and tribunals today? What gives you optimism? What makes you hopeful?
Well, what makes me hopeful is the belief that eventually we're going to get some sense into our heads in different countries and come to the conclusion that all of these things are possible, but they are not possible if we believe that they are a waste of time. We have to work at it. And I've always sort of felt, in terms of my own optimism, I wouldn't be here if some people didn't believe that there should be an answer to Nazism and to communism, for that matter, in Russia and other places. So the fact that I survived all of this and I'm working gives me optimism and gives me faith that there will be many, many young people who will be much more successful and effective than I've ever been.
Before concluding, Tom, I would like to invite you to share any final reflections or thoughts with us, perhaps a message for practitioners engaged in judicial processes around the world, and again, to young people, any final comments or thoughts you would like to share with us today?
I'm probably repeating myself, but don't give up hope, and don't give up your faith that what you're doing can change things. The commitment to changing things with the one's beliefs has to be strong, because it runs up against a lot of other things that are in the way. So I think, to me, one has to believe that what one is doing is possible and is just, and that takes a lot of doing. But this is sort of with I feel that the fact that I survived and doing what I'm doing gives me hope that there'll be many, many other people in many countries where it doesn't look good, where they will have an impact, will be able to have an impact, and I hope they will have it.
What a wonderful note to end on. Thank you very, very much, dear Tom. And thank you also to Peggy and Laura behind the scenes.
Thank you so much also. And to I saw your academy is something that is very much in my heart for what it is doing and for what it can continue to do.
Thank you, dear Tom. On that note, we have come to the end of this fascinating exchange. And once again, thank you very, very much, dear Tom, for sharing your wisdom and your warmth today. Your commitment is sincere, your passion is truly palpable, and your energy is clearly infectious. So it's been truly inspiring and refreshing to hear your views about the importance of accountability, and to hear once again your message of hope, drawing on your very distinguished life experiences. Thank you. Thank you to everyone who has been with us and has been watching. It has been a great conversation. Thank you.